All right. Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you once again to another live broadcast of our show, the WGSN-DB Going Solo Veterans Corner, coming to you live from Northern Virginia. And of course, I am your host, retired Army First Sergeant Paul Holbert. And I want to welcome all of you to our show tonight. And we're going to have a little something a little different if you notice the advertisement on the show. And we'll get to that in just a moment. Especially for those of you that watch the show on a pretty regular basis. And you're aware that, the show normally showcases veteran guests, veteran organizations and service providers. So it will be a little different tonight in honor of Veterans Day tomorrow. So we'll get into that in just a moment. But of course, before we get into our show itself, as I always do, for those of you that watch the show know, I have to thank our great sponsors who sponsor our show each year. And we are so appreciative of what they do for our veterans activities here. First, we have Quest Jewelers from Merrifield, Virginia. So I want to give a big shout out to Pete and Juan Tane there in Merrifield at Quest Jewelers. Folks, I can't stress it enough. I talk about them every week. If you want something beautiful, you want something special for that special someone, make sure you give them a call or go to their website, and you can see the information right there on your screen. And if you call them and you talk to Pete, tell him I sent you, and he will take care of you. And in fact, he will give you a discount. So feel free to call him on the phone, tell him what you're looking for, and tell him you watch our show and I sent you to his store. We also want to take a moment to thank Nationwide IT Services, located right here in Fairfax, Virginia. CK Park and his wonderful crew there at NIS. They are a service-disabled veteran-owned small business, and CK is a retired Army warrant officer. And in fact, I got to give him a shout-out here because CK and his company just recently received a platinum medallion in the Higher Vets Award category from the Department of Labor for their efforts for supporting vets and hiring veterans throughout the country, as he has different offices around the country. So congratulations to CK and his crew for more of their outstanding veteran support. And we just want to let him know that we appreciate the support that he and his company give our show. So thank you again to both of our great sponsors. And now I want to kind of get into tonight's broadcast. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, for those of you that have watched the show, you know that normally we will have we will have veteran guests, not a vest, but a veteran guest. Or we will have some other guest on, or an organization that supports veterans and their families and veterans in need. But tonight I thought we'd do something a little different because of Veterans Day. And before I really get into this, I also want to give one other shout out to the U.S. Marine Corps, who is actually celebrating their 247th birthday tomorrow. Happy birthday to the U.S. Marines. I myself spent my time in the Army, but I know a lot of Marines, and in fact have family who spent time in the Marines as well. So happy birthday to the Marine Corps, because of course they are a large part of our veteran population. So I wanted to spend some time tonight talking about veterans and why we remember what makes the remembrance of veterans, number one, why do we feel, number one, that it's necessary? And number two, why is it so special? What is it about this part of our population? And of course, a lot of you have different reasons as to why you honor veterans or why you think it's important to honor them. I mean, when you look at our society today, we have a day for just about everything you can think of, whether it's National Hot Coffee Day, or it's National Donut Day, or it's Chicken Wing Day, or some other type of day. It's Sisters Day or Family Day, and seems like every day in the calendar is assigned Love of Animals Day. There's a really good one. But Veterans Day, what is it about Veterans Day, and what is it about these veterans that make us feel like we want to remember and we want to honor them? And first of all, before I really get into that, though, I want to make sure, and most people do understand the difference, but there are some people that honestly don't. I want to make sure that we understand the difference between Veterans Day and Memorial Day. So for those of you that know, bear with me, but for those of you that aren't quite sure, I just want to clarify this before we really get into my conversation here. Remember, Memorial Day is assigned to remember those people that served in the military that gave the ultimate sacrifice. They were killed in the line of duty, killed in combat, or some other type of activity related to combat in their service, and they were killed and are no longer here. They gave that ultimate sacrifice, and that's why we have Memorial Day. Veterans Day is that day when we actually celebrate and remember all veterans, whether they're living or deceased. So, of course, keep in mind that is the big difference here. Now, it's kind of interesting when you think about it, and we think about just who are this group of people that we feel a necessity to remember. When we look at our population in the United States as of this year, we had approximately 331 million people in the United States. And out of that 331, we have about 18.5 million veterans, most of who are over, like myself, who are over the age of 50. And I'm getting up there and can feel it many a day. But when you think about it and you look at our ratio of veterans to our actual population, our veterans make up, and these are surviving veterans, our veterans make up about just a little over 0.5% of our total population. So you're talking about a very small percentage of our population that have served in the military at some point or another and that are living in the United States now. And the interesting thing about that is when you think about the history of our country, we have always been a country, first of all, that was born on the battlefield. Think about it. The Revolutionary War, we fought for our freedom. And then as our history went on, we had the War of 1812, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but then, of course, we had our own Civil War, and our history is just filled with conflicts that our country has either fought to free ourselves, fought to survive, or when it came time to places like World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, where we fought to supposedly to help or try to help and free other countries from the oppression that we escaped. So when we look at the history of our country, it's kind of easy to see why we have so many people, over 18.5 million people who have served and are alive today and are still here to tell their story. And it's kind of interesting because as time goes on and many of the veteran population gets older and older, we lose a lot of those stories. We lose a lot of those experiences and those lessons that the veterans can teach us. But it just goes to show that our veteran population is small. While we do have new people join the military and serve each year, our older generation of veterans continues to dwindle, and we lose so much of that. It's so much part of our history. So the thing is, you have such a small group of people who are serving a nation of 331 million. And it's a group of people who, at least, since 1973, when the military first decided to go back to the all-volunteer force, it's a group of people that volunteered to serve. There was no requirement after that. So we have an all-volunteer force. people join, and I just talked about this on one of my last shows, talking about why, when we were talking about life after the uniform, why people join the service. And of course, I'm not going to get into all that again, but one of the biggest reasons is we're a patriotic nation, at least for the most part. And a lot of our citizens still feel the need and the desire to either carry on a family tradition or to serve the country. So that's basically what it is we have this small portion of the population that serve the nation and are now in that category of military veterans. So when you think about it, we are a very small population. The other thing is that the military and becoming a veteran is kind of, how can I say, a unique experience. Let's face it, for those of you that have been in the military and served, you know what it's like. You know what a challenge it can be. You know, first of all, how mentally stressful it can be, not only just beginning with your training, but all through your time in the military, faced with so many different things, especially if you've faced combat. Then we look at the physical strain that so many of our veterans go through during the course of their career, whether it's the 15-mile road marches with full pack, the 5-mile runs. I remember when I first joined back in 1981, we were still running in combat boots. And if you want to do something uncomfortable, let me tell you, try running several miles in hard-soled combat boots. So spending all that time in the military is not only mentally stressful, but it can be very physically stressful as well. And of course, when you think about what a lot of our veterans go through during their career, their time in the military, especially those that are wounded and come back facing a life of struggle and physical deformity, then we look at it and say, yeah, it is a very unique population to a certain extent. And you know, the good thing is, when we think about our veteran population, you know, there are a lot of things, a lot of programs there, and I'll talk about them in a minute, that are available to help our veterans. Because when you come out of the service, whether you've only spent a few years or you've spent a career, you know, you're actually very different than you were when you first went in. And I know, just speaking from my own personal experience and my friends, you know, I'm at the point in my life where, you know, I've got the surgically altered foot, 2 knees full of metal, you know, PTSD, a hearing loss. And as you age, it can become very, very stressful. It can become a challenge to deal with. So as our veteran population, when you think about it, keep that in mind. You know, we face a unique number of challenges that, you know, quite frankly, our civilian counterparts, for the most part, do not encounter. So not only are we a very small portion of the United States population, but we're at least semi-unique in that sense, where we have faced a number of mental and physical stressors that a lot of people who do not spend time in the military have faced. So when you see a veteran, you know, whenever I see a fellow veteran on the street somewhere or something, I always feel a need to go up and talk to them. You have that brotherhood with them, you know, just to share a hi. It's good to see you. So the civilian population, a lot of our citizens are very much the same way, because I can't tell you the number of times that I have been stopped on the street or somewhere when someone will see me and I have one of my hats on, and they'll just stop and tell me, well, thank you for your service. And someone will actually stop and have a conversation with me. And so, you know, I think that feeling that we have in the country still, not only just among veterans with the camaraderie that we have, but among our civilian population that feel that need to not only recognize, but at least respect veterans. And, you know, it's good that we've come to that point in our country, because for those of you I know that served in Vietnam, for my fellow veterans, you know, I was young, but I remember the Vietnam experience, not from a military standpoint, but from a young high school student, early college. And I still remember a lot of the stories of how our Vietnam veterans were treated when they came, excuse me, when they came home from Vietnam. And so it is so enlightening and so heart lifting to see how our population's attitude has changed towards the veterans that we have in the country today. So, as I mentioned, we're a shrinking or very small portion of the population. We're kind of a unique portion of the population, and it's good because we have that section of the nation now that's beginning to realize that and beginning to realize that there's still a lot of valuable experience there and a lot of, how can I say, knowledge. Even at the point in my life, being where I'm at, I look back on some of my experiences I had in the military and some of the experiences I know my fellow veterans have had, and there just is so much I think that our nation's veterans can share with so many other people in the country, whether it's friends, family, or just people in general. So I'm proud to be a veteran. I'm proud to be part of that brotherhood. I am proud to be able to recognize veterans for Veterans Day and recognize who they are. So we're going to take just a short break. And when we come back on the other side, I want to talk just a little bit about some of those organizations that support veterans and recognize veterans as well. And then I want to kind of bring you up close and personal to a few veterans who are still alive, just to kind of give you a more personal view of who these people are. So we'll be right back after these messages from our great sponsors. All right, welcome back, everyone. After that word from our sponsors, and you have been listening to the WGSN-DB Going Solo Veterans Corner with your host, retired Army First Sergeant Paul Holbert. And we've been talking about veterans and why we remember. And I started the show off in the first half just kind of talking about veterans and who they were, a little bit about the veteran population and what kind of makes them different. The other thing that I'd like to share with you is, I mentioned before the break, the treatment that our Vietnam veterans received when they came home, and some of them were treated very badly, and You read articles of how, they were called names and how they were spat on at the airport. And, you just think about that, especially knowing what a lot of them went through. And it just breaks your heart to think that we had a population in the United States at that time that could treat our veterans that way, especially when what they do is giving up their own freedom, their own time, and often their lives to protect the freedom and lives of the people we have here in the country. So, to my Vietnam veteran brothers and sisters, I just want to give you that special remembrance because you deserved it, you earned it, and you should have it. But there are a lot of organizations in the nation now that also have remembered how important our veterans are. And I can tell you from the Veterans Administration, and I know you hear a lot of horror stories about the VA, and I know there are some veterans who have struggled to get assistance with the VA for various reasons. It was kind of interesting because shortly after I retired from the military, I was doing a public service recognition week in downtown DC, and I was at the display booth for our agency where I worked at the time, and I had a number of Iraqi freedom veterans who came in, and one of them had a prosthetic arm, and they were walking through the area, and I started talking with them, and I actually asked them, I said, how has the VA treated you? And they both actually spoke very highly of what the VA had helped them with and what they had done. And I realized that's not the case in every instance. But our VA is out there. There's a lot of good people there working hard to work with our veterans, the ones in need, the ones coming home, or that were coming home mangled and damaged and just in need of help, the families in need of help. So the VA was there to help them. We look at how that has kind of bled into other organizations. There are a number of private organizations out there, and you hear all the ones about Wounded Warrior and other large veteran support organizations that are out there trying to do good things for our veteran population because they have recognized the importance of our veteran population that's still here in the United States. The other thing is there are tributes to veterans, today more than any other time than I can ever remember in my 63 years of life. And of course, when I was very young, I wouldn't have remembered much anyway. But in my 63 years of life, I think we give veterans more credit, more, I don't want to use the word attention because that's not really what I think most veterans are seeking, but more credit, more accolades and things like that than I've ever seen at any time in my adult life. And I think it's great because you have these organizations out there working to try and provide vital services to the veterans and their families when they need help. The other thing is, it's interesting, is it's not just veteran organizations that are out there doing this. We also have veterans themselves that are involved in a lot of these types of activities. So when you think about it, we are out there as veterans trying to do the right thing. At least a lot of them are. And we have organizations run by veterans that help disabled veterans learn to fly fish, learn to transition, write resumes, train for jobs. There are veterans that work with the airlines to run those honor flights that serve veterans traveling around for various types of ceremonies and other things. So there's just so many activities and so many organizations out there now compared to what we used to have before that want to remember the veterans for who they are and what they are. And I can say myself as a veteran, I am very appreciative of those organizations, and myself being a member of the Disabled American Veterans and the Veterans of Foreign War. Both of those organizations spend an inordinate amount of time servicing veterans, providing services, opportunities, all kinds of programs. And if you ever just go to their websites and look, you will see on there what these organizations try to do for our nation's veterans. So, I think that's really wonderful what it is we are looking at and how we continue to try to remember and service our nation's veterans. So, I've been talking in general terms about who the veterans are, what portion of the population they are, the fact that, veterans are a little unique in what they've experienced and what they've gone through. But I want to kind of close it out tonight by bringing home a little close and personal information for you. And we can speak in general terms all we want, but what about who are these veterans? So I selected several veterans that I want to highlight tonight, and I chose 3 because remember, we're talking about Veterans Day, not Memorial Day, but I've chosen 3 living Medal of Honor winners, veterans who survived their time in combat, and just to share a brief portion of their story. Now, with one caveat, I had this chosen, but my first particular veteran, Woody Williams, he just died over the summer. So he was the last living Medal of Honor recipient from Vietnam, and he was living in West Virginia, and he just died over the summer. But the interesting thing about it was Woody joined the Marines when he was very young. He was just 17, and he joined the Marines in 1943. And of course, some of the first combat he saw, as you can imagine how crazy this was in February of 1923 in Iwo Jima. So for those of you that know the story about the island of Iwo Jima and the tough time our Marines had there trying to take that island, you'll know what I'm talking about. But the interesting thing about Woody was in February 23rd of 1945, Woody was deployed there on Iwo Jima trying to help take the island. And Woody became, I guess you could say, famous because that was the story. Woody single-handedly took a flamethrower and began to destroy enemy emplacements by himself, charging off and ahead of his fellow Marines in their positions, fighting the enemy. And you know what? The interesting thing about it was that got Woody the Medal of Honor. He did this for 4 hours. Can you even imagine, folks, 4 hours of this young American out there on the battlefield facing an enemy that we all know from history and from talking to veterans, who was one of the cruelest, one of the most diehard enemies we fought in World War II. He did that for 4 hours, coming back to his own lines to rearm, grab another flamethrower, and go out and continue the fight. He was finally wounded and had to give up his efforts. But folks, to see a young kid of that age conduct himself in that manner and to hear that story definitely tells us why he was awarded the Medal of Honor by President Truman. The interesting thing is Woody continued to serve in the Marines and retired 20 years later. And in his later days, he set up an organization that provides a foundation in his name that provides memorials for Gold Star families. And for those of you that know who the Gold Star families are, those are families that had family members serving that were killed in combat. And he set up the foundation that provides memorials for those families to honor their family members who were killed in combat. And he was still doing that until he died. So Woody had such a great story. I just thought I had to share that with you because this is who these people are. And granted, not every one of us who served in the military were that heroic or were in situations like that all the time. You know, many of us were in other types of situations, or of course, none. There's only a very small population of Medal of Honor winners. But it's important to understand just who these people are that we honor and we remember. So I also want to share the story of a Vietnam War veteran named Harold Fritz. Harold was actually in the U.S. Army, and in January 11th of 1969, Harold was in the Republic of Vietnam, and he was actually in a convoy of vehicles, and the convoy was hit by over 200 enemy soldiers. And of course, as they continued to fight, Sergeant Fritz, he went from vehicle to vehicle to rally his troops. He was wounded twice under fire. He distributed ammunition, pulled wounded men out from around the vehicles and tried to treat them because they didn't have a medic. And finally, he manned a machine gun on one of the tops of the vehicles and continued to fight throughout the battle. He was wounded himself and finally had to give up the fight. But at least the good thing was he was able to continue to rally his men, and they were able to fight off the enemy and chase them back into the jungle with a minimum loss of life. So again, here we have the story of a dedicated veteran who, again, a young man who was serving with 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment in Vietnam, who took it upon himself to just completely ignore his own personal safety and his own personal life to serve the country, to serve those other soldiers around him. And I think as you kind of hear these stories, you can understand why there's such a camaraderie among military members. Because if you talk to them, a lot of veterans will tell you, why did they serve? Not only did they feel they needed to serve, they wanted to serve, but they were there to serve each other. They were there to serve one another. So you often see that in these soldiers. And one of the final ones I would like to share with you is Sergeant Ryan Pitts. Sergeant Pitts was in the U.S. Army, and on July 13th of 2008, Sergeant Pitts and his a small group of soldiers were at an outpost in Afghanistan. And the outpost was immediately attacked by a wave of rocket-propelled grenades and machine gun and small arms fire. They were outgunned, they were outmanned, and Sergeant Pitts began to take hand grenades as the enemy got close. And for those of you that know how to use an HE frag hand grenade, you pull the pin on that thing and you let that spoon go, and you can actually count a few seconds depending on when you want it to explode. And that's just exactly what Sergeant Pitts was doing. The enemy was so close to their outpost that he was pulling the pins on the grenades and holding them for several seconds, and then finally throwing them so that they would explode close to the outpost where the enemy was. He did that for approximately 35 minutes. He was knocked down by an RPG, had suffered a number of shrapnel wounds, and finally, he was knocked down where he had trouble getting back up. And even though he could not get back up to physically fight, he crawled over to the outpost radio and began to relay information on the radio back to the command post for support to try and help the rest of the soldiers there at his outpost so that they could fight off the attack. So, these are just three examples, more personal examples of who some of these veterans are that we choose now as a country to honor. We choose now as a country to remember and set aside a special day. And like I said, not all veterans rise to that level. Not all veterans were put in those type of situations. It doesn't matter as a veteran whether you came in and you did your 4 years and you got out, or you came in and you spent a career and retired and moved on. you're still a veteran. You're still my brother and sister, along with all of the other veterans, and you are still a part of the population that we feel honored to be able to serve the nation and help protect our way of life. And I think that's how most veterans look at it. And as I mentioned earlier, we have just in here in Northern Virginia, we have a number of veterans in our community here that choose to spend a lot of their time still serving the community, running outreach programs, running hospital programs, serving needy people and homeless people over the holidays, whether it's Thanksgiving dinners at a lot of the centers. There are a lot of veterans that are out doing this and still, in some form or fashion, still feel the need to serve. And I know that they're serving and doing that type of stuff right along their civilian counterparts in the population. But the point being that whether you were a hero and received the Medal of Honor, or whether you served your time, did what you were asked to do, and did what you needed to do, you're a veteran. And I got to tell you, we thank you. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts. And folks, this is why we remember. This is why we set aside a day to remember those veterans, to say thank you. Thank you for what you've done. Thank you for your service. Thank you for what you've done to the nation or for the nation. And thank you for helping to protect our way of life. And that doesn't make us special or any better than anyone else. I think it just makes us a little different. Just a little different. But again, for those of you out there watching the show, my fellow veterans, thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifices. And we will definitely be thinking of you tomorrow on Veterans Day. So I want to throw something kind of light in at the end of this. You know, I was having a conversation with my wife about the show, and, you know, I was talking to her about so many things that Veterans Day give us, and we have the parades and all kinds of other things. And, you know, my wife, I got to tell you, bless her, she has got one great sense of humor. And it's one of the things I love about her. And she said, you know, she said, I have to agree, because if it wasn't for you veterans, my gosh, we wouldn't be having all those mattress sales and furniture sales and car dealership sales and everything on Veterans Day. And we both just broke out in a big laugh. So yeah, there's another part of the service that you could say is provided by the veterans for Veterans Day. But I have to thank my wife for that, because she brought some really good comic relief to some of the thoughts I was having about this show. So I want to thank you tonight for taking the time to spend this time with me on the show. And, you know, when you think about it, as you go into tomorrow on the Veterans Day, no matter where you're at, no matter where you're doing, what you're doing or where you're at, stop and just take a moment. Remember what the day is for, and remember why we remember. That's all I ask. So thank you for spending time on the show with us tonight. I also want to bring up the fact that in service to the veterans, the holidays are coming. And we all know that right now, folks, we're facing a dilemma where there are approximately 22 veteran suicides a day. So I ask you, take a look for holiday volunteer opportunities at the VFW.org, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and the Disabled American Veterans. Take a look at those two websites. Find out where they have opportunities for you to help during the holidays, because there are a lot of veterans out there in need, whether it's mentally or physically, that they could use your support and use your help. So I just ask that you take a few minutes, take a look at the websites, find out what activities are in your area, because they have stuff all over the United States, and the websites have activities that are going on around the country. Try to find a place where you can give back over the holidays, not just to veterans, but to other people in need, simply because we may find ourselves a little better off than the person next to us. Thank you for watching the show tonight. And we invite you to check out the website goingsolomedia.com. There you will find the rest of the great shows on our network, and you will also find my shows here on the Veterans Corner. But thank you for watching, and we will see you on our next show.